Martina here, and in this episode we will talk about how to stain or age paper. There are a lot of different ways you can age or stain paper, but I thought I would share my method of doing it. And now, before you go ahead and stain or age your paper, just know that it will make your paper a bit more brittle or fragile, because you're putting it through a process of wetting it, then drying it. But of course it's not so bad that it will make the paper unusable. It will just be a little more brittle than the normal paper. The two most common things to use to stain or age paper is coffee or tea. Now both of those are acidic, and as we talked about last time, acidic paper will not hold up so well over time. So I've come up with a method to try to neutralize the coffee before I apply it to the paper, and I do that by adding baking powder to the coffee. Now you can buy these pH test strips on either eBay or AliExpress for really cheap. They're not the best, but they work just fine for what we need them for. So I'll take a pH strip and test the coffee before I add the baking powder. Then I'll apply a teaspoon, check the pH value again, and keep adding the baking powder until I reach a pH value of 7, which is neutral. And then when I've reached 7, I will pour the coffee into a large and deep tray so that I can start staining my paper. As a side note to the baking powder, I'm not quite sure if the baking powder itself will do anything to the paper. All I know is that the coffee and the acid in the coffee will make the paper more brittle and fragile over time. So the way I do this is first I set the oven to 140 degrees Celsius, which is about 280 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll put 2 sheets of A3 size paper into the coffee tray at a time, and I'll use 2 more trays to cook them in the oven. I make sure to put some parchment paper underneath the paper so it won't stick to the pan though. Now, when the 2 sheets are cooking in the oven, I'll put 2 more sheets into the tray filled with coffee, and they'll just soak there until it's ready to switch out the ones in the oven. So I've had a lot of questions asking when I know that the paper is dry or how long I cook the paper for. I don't have a set timer to do this because this is pretty much a continuous process. But I will wait until I can see maybe 1 or 2 small pools of coffee on the paper, then I'll take out the tray, flip the paper over and put it back in until it's completely dry. I know it's completely dry when I take it out and I feel it, and I can't even feel any dampness on the paper at all. You might have to open up the door to let some of the moisture from the coffee run out every once in a while, because if it's too much moisture in the oven, papers won't really dry enough. I usually let my paper flatten in the book press for at least 24 hours just to really make it flat, and that will just make it so much easier to sew together later. So I've shown you my method of staining paper. Now, if you think it's a little bit too dark and you would like to make a lighter stain, you can replace the coffee with some tea instead. And also, if you just adjust the time you let the paper soak in the tray, it will become lighter. So if you just dip it in and then put it directly into the oven instead of letting it soak, then it will become a lot lighter. Now, as I mentioned, there are so many ways you can stain or age your paper. I've seen in a couple of videos that people take a whole stack of paper and just like pour coffee or tea over it and then cook the whole thing in the oven, and that has worked. I've also seen people soak a whole stack of paper and just let it air dry, and that has worked for them. In my experience when trying those methods was that I grabbed the stack and stained it, but the thing was that the paper wouldn't separate from each other properly, so they would just rip. And also the paper in the middle only got stain around the edges and not on the inside. But then again, I've seen people succeed with this method online. Another way to do it is if you already have a text block, like paper that is sewn together, you can use a spray bottle and spray each page with either tea or coffee and just flip through each page and let it air dry. Or you can just use a wet tea bag and like drag it over the pages. Using a tea bag or a spray bottle is a very easy way to control the amount of stain you apply to the page. If you want some darker stain around the edges, you can for example stain the main paper with tea and then go over with a spray bottle of coffee just around the edges and let that air dry. You can also stain it the same way I did, but air dry it instead by hanging it on clothing lines or laying it out on the floor. On the topic of air drying, I just wanted to say that if you let the paper air dry, it will become less wrinkly than if you cook it in the oven. So finally, just to summarize, there are so many different methods of staining or aging paper. The most common things to use is coffee, tea, ink, or paint to stain the paper. Just keep in mind that the pH value of the coffee or tea is acidic, and that might affect the paper and the quality of the paper. You can control how light or dark the stain is by using either tea or coffee, and also by using, for example, a spray bottle or a tea bag to control the amount of stain you apply to the page, and also just controlling how long you leave the paper in the tray to soak up the coffee. And finally, you have to decide whether to air dry or cook the paper in the oven. Leaving it to air dry will keep it more flat, but it will also take longer for the paper to dry.